The metal handcuffs clicked shut around Margaret Caldwell's wrists as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as the bailiff led the 67-year-old widow toward the defendant's table. Her crime? Allegedly, stealing cattle that had been in her family for 3 generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what nobody in that Riverside County courthouse expected was the thunderous crash of oak doors flying open, and the sight of Jake Morrison, the most feared rancher in 3 counties, storming down the aisle with fury blazing in his weathered eyes. 3 months earlier, Margaret Caldwell had been living what most would consider a peaceful retirement on the 200-acre ranch her late husband, Thomas, had left her. The rolling hills of their property in Cedar Valley, Montana, had been home to their small herd of Black Angus cattle for over 40 years. Thomas had passed the previous winter, leaving Margaret to manage the ranch alone with the help of her neighbor's teenage son, Danny Martinez, who came by twice a week to check on the animals and mend fences. Margaret had always been self-sufficient, but at 67, the physical demands of ranch life were becoming increasingly difficult. Her arthritis made morning chores painful, and the isolation of rural living weighed heavily on her grieving heart. Still, she refused her daughter's constant pleas to sell the ranch and move to Phoenix. This land held too many memories, too. Much of Thomas's spirit woven into every pasture and fence post. The trouble began when corporate developer Harrison Industries announced plans to build a luxury resort complex in Cedar Valley. The company had quietly been buying up ranch land for months, offering prices well above market value. Most of her neighbors had already sold, leaving Margaret's property as one of the few remaining holdouts in the area. Margaret had politely but firmly declined every offer from Harrison Industries. She'd thrown away their letters, hung up on their phone calls, and even asked Danny to turn away their representatives when they showed up at her gate. The land wasn't for sale, not at any price, but Harrison Industries wasn't accustomed to taking no for an answer. Their lead acquisition specialist, Vincent Harding, had built his career on convincing reluctant property owners to sell. He prided himself on finding pressure points, exploiting weaknesses, and ultimately getting signatures on contracts. Margaret Caldwell represented more than just another difficult seller. She was standing in the way of a $200 million development project. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early October. Margaret had walked out to check on her 17 head of cattle, only to find the north pasture completely empty. The fence line showed no signs of damage, the gate remained securely latched, and there were no obvious tracks leading away from the property. It was as if the cattle had simply vanished into thin air. Panicked, Margaret called the sheriff's department. Deputy Alan Foster arrived within an hour, taking notes as Margaret explained the situation. He examined the empty pasture, checked the perimeter fencing, and promised to file a report. But his tone suggested he viewed this as a low-priority case. Cattle theft wasn't exactly common in their quiet county, and at Margaret's age, it was possible she'd simply miscounted or forgotten where she'd moved the herd. 2 days later, Margaret received a registered letter from Vincent Harding's law firm. The letter accused her of trespassing on Harrison Industries' property and demanded she remove 17 head of Black Angus cattle that were allegedly grazing on land the company had recently purchased. The letter included aerial photographs showing cattle in a pasture, along with a property survey claiming the land belonged to Harrison Industries. Margaret stared at the documents in complete bewilderment. The photographs were definitely of her cattle, but the survey showed property lines that made no sense. According to these documents, Harrison Industries owned the north section of her ranch, the same pasture where her cattle had mysteriously disappeared. She immediately called her late husband's lawyer, Robert Chun, who had handled their affairs for over 20 years. Chun promised to investigate and advised Margaret not to sign anything or respond to any communications from Harrison Industries until he could review the situation. But Vincent Harding had no intention of waiting for lawyers to sort through property disputes. Within 48 hours of sending the letter, he took decisive action that would change Margaret's life forever. Harding's next move was calculated and ruthless. He contacted Sheriff Coleman directly, bypassing the usual channels and deputy assignments. Sheriff Coleman, nearing retirement and eager to avoid controversy, listened as Harding presented what appeared to be an open and shut case of cattle theft. Armed with official-looking property surveys, photographs of the cattle, and legal documents stamped with corporate seals, Harding painted Margaret as a confused elderly woman who refused to acknowledge legitimate property ownership. The warrant for Margaret's arrest was issued on a Friday afternoon. Deputy Foster, the same officer who had initially taken her missing cattle report, found himself in the uncomfortable position of serving papers on the woman he'd promised to help just days earlier. When he arrived at Margaret's ranch that evening, she was in her garden, pulling the last tomatoes before the first frost. "Mrs. Caldwell," Foster said quietly, his hat in his hands, "I'm real sorry about this, but I have a warrant here for your arrest." Margaret straightened slowly, soil still clinging to her gardening gloves. "A warrant? For what?" "Cattle theft, ma'am, and trespassing." Foster's voice was barely above a whisper. "You have the right to remain silent." The words felt surreal as they echoed across the quiet ranch. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. Her own cattle, on her own land, and somehow she was being arrested for theft. She thought of Thomas, of all the years they'd worked this land together, and felt a crushing weight of injustice settling on her shoulders. The booking process at the county jail was humiliating. Margaret had never been fingerprinted, never had a mugshot taken, never spent a night in a cell. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she sat on a thin mattress, staring at concrete walls and wondering how her life had spiraled so completely out of control in less than a week. Robert Chun worked through the weekend to secure her release on bail, but the damage was already done. By Monday morning, news of Margaret Caldwell's arrest had spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire. The local newspaper ran a front-page story: "Local rancher arrested for cattle theft." The article presented the facts without context, making Margaret appear to be exactly what Harrison Industries wanted: a confused old woman who'd lost touch with reality. Margaret's daughter, Susan, drove up from Phoenix immediately. She found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, still in the clothes she'd worn to jail, staring out at the empty north pasture where her cattle should have been grazing. "Mom, this is insane," Susan said, taking her mother's hands. "We need to fight this. With what money, honey?" Margaret's voice was hollow. "Your father's life insurance barely covered his medical bills. I've got maybe $15,000 in savings, and Chun says a good defense attorney will cost 5 times that. Then sell the ranch, take Harrison's offer, and walk away." Margaret pulled her hands free. "This land is all I have left of your father, of our life together. I won't let some corporate vultures steal it from me." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret felt her resolve wavering. The legal system seemed designed to crush people like her people, without teams of lawyers and unlimited resources. Every day brought new challenges: court dates, legal fees, and the constant stress of potential imprisonment hanging over her head. Vincent Harding sensed her weakness and moved to exploit it. He arranged for Harrison Industries to make a new offer, one that appeared generous on the surface but came with a deadline. Margaret had 72 hours to accept, or the company would pursue the cattle theft charges to the fullest extent of the law. They would also file civil suits for damages, legal fees, and lost development profits that could potentially leave her bankrupt and homeless. The offer was accompanied by a carefully crafted media campaign. Harrison Industries Public Relations team painted the company as patient and generous, trying to resolve a difficult situation with an elderly woman who was clearly struggling with the loss of her husband and the demands of ranch life. They suggested that Margaret's confusion about property boundaries was understandable given her age and recent bereavement, and that the company was willing to overlook the cattle incident in exchange for a reasonable business transaction. Meanwhile, Margaret found herself increasingly isolated. Several longtime friends in Cedar Valley had already sold their properties to Harrison Industries and moved away. Others seemed uncomfortable around her, as if criminal charges might be contagious. Even at the grocery store, she noticed whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late October. Margaret, dressed in her best black dress, the same one she'd worn to Thomas's funeral, and met Robert Chun at the courthouse steps. Chun had spent weeks preparing, gathering evidence and building a defense, but his expression was grim. "Margaret, I need to be honest with you," he said as they walked toward the building. "Harrison Industries has some very expensive lawyers, and they've built a compelling case on paper. The property surveys look legitimate, the photographs are damaging, and the timing of everything makes you appear guilty. But I'm not guilty, Robert. Those are my cattle on my land. I believe you. But belief isn't enough in a courtroom. We need proof, and right now, their evidence looks stronger than ours." The courthouse was more crowded than Margaret had expected. Harrison Industries had brought a full legal team, 3 attorneys in expensive suits carrying briefcases and tablets. Vincent Harding sat in the front row, watching the proceedings with the satisfied expression of a man who knew the outcome before the game began. Margaret felt small and vulnerable as she took her place at the defendant's table. The charges were read aloud: grand theft, trespassing, and interfering with lawful business operations. Each word felt like a physical blow, transforming her from a grieving widow into a common criminal in the eyes of the law. The prosecutor, District Attorney Sarah Walsh, presented Harrison Industries' case with polished efficiency. She displayed the aerial photographs showing cattle on disputed land, referenced the property surveys establishing corporate ownership, and highlighted Margaret's refusal to respond to legitimate legal notices. Walsh painted a picture of an elderly woman who had become confused about property boundaries and was now too stubborn to admit her mistake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Your Honor," Walsh concluded, "this case represents a clear violation of property rights. Harrison Industries has been patient and generous in their attempts to resolve this matter privately, but Mrs. Caldwell has refused all reasonable offers and continues to deny the evidence." Robert Chun's defense focused on the suspicious timing of events and the questionable authenticity of Harrison Industries' property claims. He argued that the surveys contradicted decades of county records, and that the sudden appearance of Margaret's cattle on disputed land suggested manipulation rather than theft. But Judge Patricia Reynolds seemed more impressed by the corporate presentation than Chin's arguments. She scheduled the case for trial in 6 weeks, denied Chun's motion to dismiss the charges, and set bail at $50,000, an amount that would require Margaret to mortgage her ranch to stay out of jail. As the hearing concluded, Margaret felt the walls of the legal system closing around her. She watched Vincent Harding shake hands with the prosecution team, their satisfied smiles confirming what she already knew. This had never been about cattle or property disputes. This was about power, money, and the systematic destruction of anyone who stood in the way of corporate profits. The bailiff approached with handcuffs, explaining that Margaret would need to be processed again since her original bail had been revoked pending the new amount. As the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists for the second time in 2 weeks, Margaret finally broke down. The tears she'd been holding back since Thomas's death came pouring out, her body shaking with sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. It was at that exact moment, with Margaret Caldwell handcuffed and crying, With Harrison Industries, legal team celebrating their victory. With the judge preparing to leave the bench, that the courthouse doors exploded open with a crash that made everyone jump. Jake Morrison stood in the doorway, his 6'4" frame filling the entrance. Like an avenging angel. His weathered face was set in an expression of pure fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Behind him, the autumn sunlight streamed through the doorway, creating a silhouette that made him appear larger than life. Morrison owned the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, commanded respect from every rancher and businessman in the region, and had never lost a legal battle in his 63 years. He was also Thomas Caldwell's oldest friend, and he had spent the last month conducting his own investigation into Harrison Industries' activities. "Your Honor," Morrison's voice boomed across the courtroom, "I have evidence that will change everything you think you know about this case." Judge Reynolds looked up sharply from her papers, clearly annoyed by the dramatic interruption. "Mr. Morrison, this court is in session. You cannot simply—" "Your Honor, with all due respect," Morrison interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "I have documentation that proves Harrison Industries has committed fraud, conspiracy, and conspiracy to commit theft. Evidence that will exonerate Mrs. Caldwell and expose the real criminals in this courtroom." Vincent Harding shot to his feet, his face flushing red. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Morrison has no standing in this case and cannot simply walk in here making wild accusations." "Wild accusations?" Morrison turned toward Harding, his eyes blazing. "Is that what you call documented proof of your company bribing county officials to falsify property records?" The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Reynolds banged her gavel sharply. "Order." "Mr. Morrison, approach the bench immediately." Morrison strode forward, pulling a thick manila envelope from his jacket. "Your Honor, 3 weeks ago I hired Blackstone Investigations, the same firm that handles security for the Montana Cattlemen's Association. What they discovered will shock this court." Judge Reynolds examined the envelope's contents, her expression growing increasingly grave as she flipped through page after page of documents. After several minutes of tense silence, she looked up at Morrison. "These are serious allegations. How did you come by this information?" "Thomas Caldwell was my best friend for 40 years, Morrison replied, his voice softening slightly. "When I heard about Margaret's situation, I knew something wasn't right. Thomas was the most meticulous record keeper I ever knew. Every fence post, every property marker, every head of cattle was documented down to the square foot. There was no way Margaret could be confused about her property boundaries." Morrison turned to address the entire courtroom. "So I started digging. First, I contacted the county assessor's office to review the original property deeds. What I found was interesting. The records Harrison Industries used in their surveys had been modified just 2 weeks before Margaret's cattle disappeared. Modified by someone with administrative access to the county database." "District Attorney." Walsh leaned forward. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Morrison. Do you have proof?" Morrison smiled grimly. "I have more than proof. I have a confession." He pulled out a small digital recorder. 3 days ago, Harrison Industries IT contractor, Marcus Webb, approached me through an intermediary. Turns out Mr. Webb has been struggling with his conscience ever since he was paid to hack into the county property database and alter the records. Vincent Harding's face had gone pale. "Your Honor, this is hearsay. Whatever this man claims cannot be admitted as evidence without proper—" "Actually," Judge Reynolds interrupted, studying the documents Morrison had provided, "Mr. Morrison appears to have followed proper legal channels. These documents include sworn affidavits, time-stamped computer logs, and what appears to be photographic evidence. Mr. Morrison, please continue." Morrison pressed play on the recorder. Marcus Webb's nervous voice filled the silent courtroom. "They paid me $50,000 to change the property records." Vincent Harding said it was just a boundary dispute, that they were correcting an old clerical error. But when I saw the news about the old lady getting arrested, I realized what they'd really done. They used my work to frame her for stealing her own cattle. I can't live with that on my conscience. The recording continued with Webb providing detailed technical explanations of exactly how he'd accessed the county database, which records he'd modified, and when the changes had been made. The timestamp showed the alterations occurred just hours before Margaret's cattle mysteriously disappeared. Morrison stopped the recorder and faced Vincent Harding directly. "But that's just the beginning. Tell the court about the cattle, Vincent." Harding remained silent, but his attorney jumped up. "Your Honor, we object to this entire proceeding. Mr. Morrison has no authority to interrogate our client. Sit down," Judge Reynolds ordered sharply. She was now studying a photograph from Morrison's envelope. "Mr. Morrison, explain this image to the court." Morrison walked over to Margaret, who was still handcuffed and tearful at the defendant's table. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Margaret, remember how you always said Thomas branded his cattle in a unique way? That extra mark behind the left ear?" Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "He called it his signature. Every head of cattle got the main brand on the hip and the small TC mark behind the left ear. He said it was insurance against theft." Morrison held up the photograph for the court to see. This picture was taken yesterday at Harrison Industries' temporary holding facility outside Billings. Those are Margaret's cattle, identifiable by Thomas Caldwell's distinctive marking system. They've been there for 3 weeks, ever since they were illegally removed from her property. The courtroom buzzed with shocked whispers. Vincent Harding looked like he might be sick. "But here's where it gets really interesting," Morrison continued. He pulled out another document. "Harrison Industries doesn't just have Margaret's cattle. According to the facility records I obtained through a court order yesterday, they're also holding livestock belonging to 7 other ranchers who refused to sell their properties. Ranchers who were then mysteriously accused of various violations and forced to surrender their animals pending legal resolution." Judge Reynolds set down her gavel with a heavy thud. "Are you telling this court that Harrison Industries has been systematically stealing cattle to pressure property owners into selling?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Your Honor. But it gets worse." Morrison's voice grew harder. "The company hasn't just been stealing livestock. They've been bribing county officials to fast-track their legal cases, falsifying environmental impact reports to bypass state regulations, and using intimidation tactics that would make organized crime blush." Morrison pulled out a thick folder. "I have documented evidence of Harrison Industries paying County Clerk Jennifer Walsh, yes, the same Jennifer Walsh who happens to be married to District Attorney Sarah Walsh, $25,000 to expedite property transfers and seal certain records from public view." District Attorney Walsh shot to her feet, her face bright red. "That's completely false. I resent the implication." "The implication?" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Lady, I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts backed up by bank records, wire transfer receipts, and recorded phone conversations. Your husband took money to help Harrison Industries steal people's property, and you've been prosecuting their victims to cover it up." Judge Reynolds banged her gavel repeatedly as the courtroom erupted in chaos. "Order! Everyone sit down immediately or I'll clear this courtroom." As the noise died down, Morrison approached Margaret's table and knelt beside her chair. "Margaret, I'm sorry it took me so long to figure this out. Thomas would never forgive me if I let these vultures destroy everything you two built together." Margaret was crying again, but now her tears were of relief rather than despair. "Jake, I thought I was losing my mind. When the police said I'd stolen my own cattle, I started wondering if grief had made me confused about everything." "You're not confused. Margaret, you're the victim of a conspiracy that goes all the way to the top of county government." Morrison stood and faced Vincent Harding. Which brings us to the final piece of evidence. Morrison walked over to Harrison Industries' legal table, where Vincent Harding sat rigid with fear and anger. 3 months ago, Harrison Industries discovered that Margaret Caldwell's property contained a natural underground spring that provides water rights to over 12,000 acres of surrounding land. Without those water rights, their luxury resort development would be impossible to complete. He placed another document on the judge's bench. This is a confidential internal memo from Harrison Industries' development team. It outlines their strategy to acquire Margaret's property by any means necessary, including what they call legal pressure tactics and reputation management. The memo specifically mentions using livestock theft charges to force her into bankruptcy. Judge Reynolds read the document, her expression growing darker with each paragraph. Mr. Harding, I'm going to ask you directly. Did Harrison Industries orchestrate the theft of Mrs. Caldwell's cattle to pressure her into selling her property? Harding's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Harding brushed him away. His corporate composure was cracking under the weight of the evidence. Your Honor, everything we did was within the bounds of legitimate business practices. If there were administrative errors in the property records, that's not our fault. Administrative errors? Morrison's voice boomed across the courtroom. You paid a hacker to falsify government records, stole a widow's cattle, and tried to frame her for theft. That's not business, that's organized crime. The judge held up her hand for silence. Mr. Morrison, do you have evidence linking Mr. Harding personally to these activities? Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom. Your Honor, I have Vincent Harding on video surveillance footage directing the removal of Margaret's cattle from her property. I have phone records showing calls between Harding and the various officials he bribed. And I have testimony from 4 Harrison Industries employees who were ordered to participate in what Harding called property acquisition support activities. Morrison pulled out a final folder, this one even thicker than the others. But most importantly, I have copies of Harding's personal emails to his supervisors at Harrison Industries. Emails where he bragged about his ability to neutralize property owner resistance and detailed exactly how he planned to destroy Margaret Caldwell's life. Judge Reynolds stood up abruptly. Bailiff, remove Mrs. Caldwell's handcuffs immediately. Mrs. Caldwell, this court apologizes for the injustice you have suffered. As the handcuffs fell away from Margaret's wrists, she rubbed the red marks they'd left behind. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe freely. Furthermore, Judge Reynolds continued, I'm issuing an immediate warrant for Vincent Harding's arrest on charges of conspiracy, fraud, theft, and bribery. Bailiff, please take Mr. Harding into custody. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the man who had orchestrated Margaret's downfall was led away in handcuffs. His expensive suit and corporate arrogance couldn't protect him now from the consequences of his actions, but Morrison wasn't finished. He had one more surprise that would ensure Margaret's complete vindication and Harrison Industries' total destruction. As Vincent Harding was led away in handcuffs, Morrison turned back to Judge Reynolds with a look that suggested his presentation was far from over. The courtroom remained eerily quiet, everyone sensing that more revelations were coming. Your Honor, there's something else the court needs to know about Harrison Industries' operations in Cedar Valley. Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out what appeared to be a small electronic device. This is a GPS tracker that I found attached to the underside of Margaret's pickup truck 2 weeks ago. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. They were following me 24 hours a day for the past month, Morrison confirmed grimly. But that's not the worst part. Harrison Industries has been conducting illegal surveillance on every property owner in the valley who refused to sell. Hidden cameras, phone tapping, even going through people's garbage looking for information they could use against them. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, her expression increasingly troubled. Mr. Morrison, are you suggesting this goes beyond simple property fraud? Your Honor, what I'm suggesting is that Harrison Industries has been running a systematic campaign of harassment, intimidation, and illegal surveillance that makes their cattle theft operation look like child's play. Morrison walked to the center of the courtroom. I have documented evidence of at least 15 separate felonies committed against Cedar Valley residents over the past 6 months. Morrison pulled out yet another folder, this one marked with red tape. 3 weeks ago, elderly rancher Bill Henderson died of what appeared to be a heart attack. Bill had been one of the most vocal opponents of Harrison Industries' development plans. What the coroner didn't know was that someone had been dumping industrial chemicals into Bill's well water for over a month. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. District Attorney Walsh, still reeling from the accusations about her husband, looked pale and shaken. Are you accusing Harrison Industries of murder? Judge Reynolds asked quietly. I'm presenting facts and letting the court draw its own conclusions, Morrison replied. Bill Henderson's well water contained levels of arsenic and mercury that were 20 times higher than EPA safety limits. The chemicals didn't occur naturally, they were introduced deliberately over time. Bill's symptoms over his final weeks were consistent with heavy metal poisoning, not heart disease. Morrison placed a water analysis report on the judge's bench. I had similar tests run on the water supplies of 5 other property owners who refused to sell to Harrison Industries. 3 showed evidence of deliberate contamination. The other 2 had their wells mysteriously run dry after Harrison Industries began geological surveys in the area. Margaret felt sick as the implications sank in. Jake, are you saying they tried to poison all of us? I'm saying they used every dirty trick they could think of to force people off their land. Poisoned water, stolen livestock, falsified legal documents, bribery, intimidation, and when all else failed, they weren't above causing accidents. Morrison turned to face the Harrison Industries legal team, who were now huddled together in urgent whispered conversation. Tell the court about Ilana Rodriguez, gentlemen. Tell them about the brake lines on her truck. The lead corporate attorney, James Patterson, stood up shakily. Your Honor, we object to these wild conspiracy theories. Mr. Morrison is making accusations without foundation. Without foundation? Morrison's voice rose to a roar. Ilana Rodriguez is alive today only because she's a better mechanic than your sabotage team gave her credit for. She noticed the brake fluid leak before she drove down Cedar Valley Canyon. If she hadn't, Harrison Industries would have had another accidental death to add to their acquisition strategy. Judge Reynolds stood up abruptly. This court is taking a 30-minute recess. I need to review all of this evidence immediately. Everyone except counsel will clear the courtroom. As people filed out, Morrison approached Margaret, who was still sitting at the defendant's table, overwhelmed by everything she'd learned. Margaret, I know this is a lot to take in. They killed Bill Henderson? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. That sweet old man who used to bring me tomatoes from his garden? Morrison nodded grimly. Bill discovered what they were doing to his well water. He'd started testing it himself after his cattle got sick. I found his notes hidden in his barn. He was planning to go to the FBI. Margaret closed her eyes, thinking of all the strange incidents over the past few months that now made terrible sense. The fence posts that kept breaking, the water pressure problems, the weird phone calls with no one on the other end. They were systematically wearing you down, trying to make you feel isolated and helpless. It's a classic intimidation strategy. Morrison sat down beside her. But Margaret, there's something else you need to know. Something about Thomas. Margaret looked up sharply. What about Thomas? Morrison hesitated, clearly struggling with what he was about to reveal. Thomas didn't just die of cancer, Margaret. The autopsy showed traces of the same chemicals we found in Bill Henderson's well. Thomas had been slowly poisoned for months before his diagnosis. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She doubled over, her hand pressed to her stomach as if she'd been punched. No, that can't be true. The doctors said it was lung cancer from his smoking years. The doctors saw what they expected to see. An older man with a history of smoking develops aggressive cancer. It seemed straightforward. But when I had his medical records reviewed by a toxicologist, the pattern became clear. The chemical suppressed his immune system and triggered the rapid growth of existing cancer cells. Margaret's world seemed to tilt sideways. Everything she thought she knew about her husband's death was crumbling. They murdered him. They murdered Thomas to get our land. I believe they did, Morrison said softly. Thomas was the strongest voice against their development plans. He'd organized the other ranchers, hired lawyers, even contacted environmental groups. Harrison Industries needed him out of the way. Margaret sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what Morrison was telling her. Her grief over Thomas's death was now compounded by rage at the injustice of his murder. Judge Reynolds reconvened the court. Her expression was grim. She'd spent the recess reviewing Morrison's evidence with 2 assistant judges and the court clerk. The weight of what she'd discovered was evident in her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have uncovered here today represents one of the most extensive criminal conspiracies in this county's history. Based on the evidence presented by Mr. Morrison, I am immediately issuing warrants for the arrest of Harrison Industries CEO Richard Harrison, CFO Michael Stevens, and 12 other company executives. The remaining members of Harrison Industries' legal team looked like they wanted to flee the courtroom. Their client company was being systematically dismantled in real time. Furthermore, Judge Reynolds continued, I am ordering the immediate seizure of all Harrison Industries assets in this county, including their temporary livestock holding facility. Mrs. Caldwell, your cattle will be returned to you today, along with the livestock belonging to other victimized ranchers. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks again, but now they were tears of vindication and relief. Additionally, the judge announced, I am referring this entire matter to the FBI for federal investigation. The scope of Harrison Industries' criminal activities appears to extend across state lines and involves federal crimes, including wire fraud, environmental crimes, and possible homicide. Morrison stood up. Your Honor, there's one more thing the court should know. Harrison Industries isn't just a development company. They're a front operation for a much larger criminal organization that specializes in land acquisition fraud across the western United States. He placed a final document on the judge's bench. This is a report from the Montana Attorney General's office. Harrison Industries is connected to similar schemes in Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada. They've stolen millions of dollars worth of property from rural landowners using identical tactics, falsified records, stolen livestock, intimidated witnesses, and eliminated opposition. Judge Reynolds examined the document, her expression growing even more serious. Mr. Morrison, how did you come by this information? When I started investigating Harrison Industries, I contacted other cattlemen's associations across the region. Turns out, similar mysterious cattle thefts and property disputes have been happening everywhere Harrison Industries tries to develop land. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Morrison turned to address Margaret directly. Margaret, you weren't just fighting for your ranch. You were fighting for every small landowner who's ever been targeted by corporate predators like Harrison Industries. Your refusal to give up exposed their entire operation. District Attorney Sarah Walsh, who had been conspicuously quiet since the accusations about her husband's bribery, finally stood up. Your Honor, given the evidence presented today, the state is immediately dropping all charges against Margaret Caldwell. We will also be conducting a full review of all cases involving Harrison Industries to determine if other innocent people were wrongly prosecuted. Judge Reynolds nodded approvingly. Mrs. Caldwell, this court formally apologizes for the injustice. You have suffered. You are completely exonerated of all charges, and I am ordering Harrison Industries to pay full restitution for your legal fees, emotional distress, and punitive damages." Margaret stood up slowly, still processing everything that had happened. After weeks of feeling helpless and alone, she was suddenly surrounded by people fighting for justice on her behalf. "Your Honor," Margaret said quietly, "I just want my cattle back and to be left alone to grieve my husband in peace." "You'll have much more than that," Morrison promised. "Harrison Industries is going to pay for every crime they've committed, every life they've destroyed, and every dollar they've stolen. Thomas would be proud of how you stood up to them." As the court session concluded, Margaret found herself surrounded by reporters, FBI agents, and other ranchers who had been victimized by Harrison Industries. But all she really wanted was to go home to her ranch, to sit on the porch where she and Thomas used to watch the sunset, and to know that his death would finally be avenged. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since Thomas's death, Margaret Caldwell felt like she might actually win. The FBI arrived in Cedar Valley within 48 hours of Judge Reynolds' court session, transforming the quiet rural community into the center of a major federal investigation. Special Agent Diana Reeves, a veteran investigator specializing in corporate fraud and organized crime, established a command center at the Cedar Valley Community Hall, turning the building where residents had once gathered for harvest festivals into the nerve center of a multi-state criminal investigation. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the stream of federal vehicles driving past her ranch toward the Harrison Industries temporary facility. For months, she'd felt like she was fighting an impossible battle against forces too powerful to defeat. Now, the same government that had seemed ready to destroy her was mobilizing to bring her husband's killers to justice. Agent Reeves knocked on Margaret's door that first Friday morning, accompanied by Dr. Sarah Kim, a forensic toxicologist from the FBI's Specialized Crimes Unit. Margaret invited them into her living room, where Thomas's reading chair still sat exactly as he'd left it, his favorite ranching magazines stacked neatly on the side table. "Mrs. Caldwell," Agent Reeves began gently, "I need to ask you some difficult questions about your husband's final months. I know this is painful, but understanding the timeline of his poisoning could be crucial to building our case." Margaret nodded, gripping Thomas's coffee mug that she'd been carrying around the house since his death. "What do you need to know?" Dr. Kim opened her laptop and pulled up a medical chart. According to the information Mr. Morrison provided, Thomas began showing symptoms consistent with heavy metal poisoning approximately 8 months before his death. "Can you remember when you first noticed changes in his health?" Margaret thought back to those difficult months. "It started with fatigue. Thomas was the strongest man I knew, worked from sunrise to sunset his entire life. But suddenly, he couldn't make it through the morning without needing a nap. I thought it was just age catching up with him." "What other symptoms did you notice?" Dr. Kim asked, taking notes. "Memory problems. Thomas could remember the exact date he'd purchased every head of cattle we'd ever owned, but he started forgetting simple things, names of neighbors he'd known for decades, where he'd put his truck keys. Sometimes he'd start a sentence and then stop, looking confused." Agent Reeves leaned forward. "Mrs. Caldwell, during this period, did anyone from Harrison Industries contact you directly? Visits, phone calls, any kind of communication?" Margaret frowned, trying to recall the sequence of events. "Vincent Harding started calling about 10 months ago. At first, it was just polite inquiries about whether we might be interested in selling. Thomas always hung up on him, said we'd never sell to corporate vultures." "How did Harding respond to those rejections?" "He kept calling, sometimes twice a week. Then the letters started coming. Certified mail, legal-looking documents. Thomas would tear them up without reading them and throw them in the fireplace." Dr. Kim consulted her notes. "The toxicology report shows that Thomas was exposed to a combination of arsenic and mercury over an extended period. These chemicals would have been virtually tasteless in small doses, especially if introduced into a water supply. Margaret set down Thomas's coffee mug with shaking hands. Our well water. He always said it tasted different last year, kind of metallic. He thought it was because the well was getting old. Agent Reeves and Dr. Kim exchanged glances. Mrs. Caldwell, we need to test your current water supply immediately. If they were poisoning Thomas, there's a chance they might still be contaminating your well. Within hours, a team of EPA specialists descended on Margaret's ranch with sophisticated testing equipment. They collected samples from her well, the holding tanks, and even the pipes running into her house. The preliminary results were terrifying. Her water contained levels of heavy metals that were potentially lethal. Mrs. Caldwell, Agent Reeves explained as the hazmat team worked to purify her water system. You cannot drink, cook with, or even bathe in this water until we've completely flushed and decontaminated your entire system. Harrison Industries has been slowly poisoning you for over a year. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thought about all the mornings she'd made coffee with that water, all the meals she'd cooked, all the time she'd felt inexplicably tired or sick, and attributed it to grief. They were trying to kill me too, it appears so. The concentration of toxins in your current system suggests they increased the dosing after Thomas's death, probably hoping to force you off the property more quickly. That evening Margaret sat on Jake Morrison's porch, unable to return to her own home while the decontamination work continued. Morrison brought her a cup of tea made with bottled water and sat down heavily in the chair beside her. I keep thinking about all the signs I missed, Margaret said quietly. Thomas getting sick, the strange phone calls, the water tasting off. How could I have been so blind? You weren't blind, Margaret. You were dealing with professionals who've perfected these techniques over years of practice. They knew exactly how to make everything seem coincidental and unrelated. Morrison pulled out his phone and showed her a news article. Look at this. The FBI raided Harrison Industries offices in Denver, Phoenix, and Albuquerque simultaneously this morning. They're finding evidence of identical schemes in dozens of rural communities across the West. Margaret read the headline, Multi-million-dollar land fraud ring exposed. FBI arrests 47 corporate executives in coordinated raids. The article detailed how Harrison Industries had been operating under various corporate names, targeting rural landowners with valuable water rights or strategic development potential. According to this, Margaret said, scanning the article, they've stolen property worth over $200 million in the past 5 years. And we're just one of hundreds of families they've destroyed. But you're also the one who stopped them, Morrison reminded her. If you'd given up and sold your ranch, they would have gotten away with it. Your stubbornness saved every future victim they would have targeted. 3 days later, Agent Reeves returned to Margaret's ranch with news that would forever change how she viewed her husband's death. The FBI's investigation had uncovered Harrison Industries' detailed operational plans, including internal memos that specifically discussed eliminating primary resistance in Cedar Valley. Margaret, we found Vincent Harding's personal files. Agent Reeves explained, settling into Margaret's newly safe kitchen. He kept meticulous records of every aspect of their operations, including detailed profiles of the ranchers they were targeting. Agent Reeves opened a thick folder marked Confidential. This is Harrison Industries' file on you and Thomas. It contains surveillance photos of your property, detailed financial information about your ranch, and a psychological profile designed to identify your vulnerabilities. Margaret stared at photographs of herself hanging laundry, of Thomas working with the cattle, of their quiet evening walks around the property. They were watching us like lab rats. The file also contains what they called a succession timeline. Agent Reeves continued grimly. It details their plan to eliminate Thomas first, then systematically break down your resistance through legal harassment, financial pressure, and escalating health threats. Agent Reeves turned to a page marked with red tabs. Margaret, this document proves that Harrison Industries deliberately murdered your husband. They tracked his declining health week by week, adjusting the toxin levels in your water supply to ensure his death appeared natural but occurred within their desired time frame. Margaret felt a cold rage settling over her as she processed the clinical brutality of their plan. Thomas hadn't just died of cancer. He'd been systematically executed by corporate assassins who treated human life as nothing more than an obstacle to profit. There's more, Agent Reeves said quietly. The file contains contingency plans for your death as well. If the legal harassment and financial pressure hadn't worked, they were prepared to stage an accident. The brake line sabotage they used on Elena Rodriguez was actually a trial run for what they planned to do to you. That afternoon, Margaret found herself at Thomas's grave for the first time since the courthouse revelations. She knelt beside his headstone, her hands resting on the earth where he lay, and finally spoke the words she'd been carrying in her heart. They murdered you, Thomas. Those corporate bastards poisoned you like a dog, and I almost let them get away with it. Her voice broke as tears streamed down her face. But I didn't give up. I held on to our ranch, and Jake helped me expose them. They're going to pay for what they did to you. She stayed at his grave until sunset, telling him about the FBI investigation, about the dozens of Harrison Industries executives who were now in federal custody, about the congressional hearings that were being planned to address corporate land fraud. She promised him that their ranch would never be sold, never be developed, never be turned into the luxury resort that had cost him his life. When she finally returned to her truck, Margaret found Jake Morrison waiting for her, leaning against his own vehicle with his arms crossed. "Thought you might want some company," he said simply. Margaret nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "Jake, what's going to happen to all the other families Harrison Industries destroyed? The people who lost their land before we figured out what was happening?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Agent Reeves told me the federal government is setting up a victim compensation fund. Every property that was illegally acquired through fraud will be returned to its original owners or their heirs. Harrison Industries' assets are being liquidated to pay restitution. And the executives? Looking at life sentences for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Vincent Harding alone is facing 17 federal charges. His cooperation with prosecutors might save him from the death penalty, but he'll never see freedom again." As they drove back toward Margaret's ranch, she watched the familiar landscape rolling past in the gathering dusk. The same hills where she and Thomas had built their life together, the same pastures where their cattle had grazed, the same horizon that had framed their dreams for over 40 years. "Thomas always said this land would outlast us all," Margaret said quietly. He was right. Harrison Industries thought they could steal it, but the land endures. The truth endures. Justice endures. Morrison nodded. "And now the whole world knows that Margaret Caldwell is not someone you want to cross. You've become a legend, Margaret. Every corporate bully in America is going to think twice before they try to push around another rural landowner." Margaret smiled for the first time in months, feeling Thomas's presence in the approaching darkness, in the familiar creak of the truck's suspension, in the endless Montana sky that had witnessed their love story and would now witness her triumph over those who had tried to destroy everything they'd built together. The battle was won, but Margaret knew the real work was just beginning. She had a ranch to rebuild, a community to heal, and a husband's memory to honor. And she had all the time in the world to do it right. 6 months after the courtroom confrontation that exposed Harrison Industries' criminal empire, Margaret Caldwell stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C., her weathered hands gripping the microphone as she prepared to deliver testimony that would reshape federal law enforcement's approach to corporate crime. The hearing room was packed with reporters, congressional staffers, and other victims of Harrison Industries schemes. Margaret had never imagined that her fight to save her ranch would lead her to the halls of Congress, but Agent Reeves had convinced her that her story could prevent similar tragedies from happening to other rural families. Senators, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. My name is Margaret Caldwell, and I'm here to tell you how a major corporation murdered my husband, stole my cattle, and tried to frame me for theft, all to acquire 200 acres of Montana ranch land. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chair, leaned forward. Mrs. Caldwell, thank you for your courage in coming forward. Your testimony has been instrumental in our investigation into corporate land fraud. Please tell the committee about the scope of what you've discovered. Margaret consulted the notes that Agent Reeves had helped her prepare. Harrison Industries didn't just target my family. FBI investigators have now confirmed similar operations in 47 rural communities across 12 states. The total value of illegally acquired property exceeds $800 million, and we've documented at least 36 suspicious deaths among landowners who refused to sell. The statistics were staggering, but Margaret knew that numbers alone couldn't convey the human cost of Harrison Industries' crimes. She thought of Bill Henderson, who had died believing his heart had simply given out from old age. She thought of Elena Rodriguez, who had nearly plunged to her death when her sabotaged brakes failed on a mountain road. She thought of the dozens of families who had lost their generational farms and ranches to fraudulent legal schemes. But what you need to understand, Margaret continued, is that this wasn't just about money or land development. This was about the systematic destruction of rural communities and the people who've spent generations building their lives on the land. Senator Michael Torres, a rancher himself before entering politics, nodded grimly. Mrs. Caldwell, based on your experience, what changes in federal law do you believe are necessary to prevent this type of corporate predation? Margaret had spent weeks preparing for this question, working with Agent Reeves and a team of FBI specialists to develop comprehensive recommendations. First, we need mandatory federal oversight of any large-scale rural land acquisitions. When a corporation tries to buy more than a certain amount of property in a rural area, that should trigger automatic federal review. She turned to address the television cameras broadcasting the hearing live across the country. Second, we need to treat deliberate contamination of water supplies as an act of terrorism. Harrison Industries poisoned my husband's drinking water for months, knowing it would kill him. That's not corporate misconduct, that's murder. Senator Williams consulted her notes. Mrs. Caldwell, the Department of Justice has informed this committee that Harrison Industries' methods were far more sophisticated than typical corporate fraud. Can you explain what made their operation so effective? Margaret thought back to the FBI's briefings, where she'd learned the full scope of Harrison Industries' criminal infrastructure. They had specialists for everything. Computer hackers, too. Falsify government records, toxicologists to design untraceable poisons, surveillance experts to monitor their targets, corrupt officials to manipulate the legal system, and even psychological profilers to identify each victim's vulnerabilities. She paused, remembering the thick file of surveillance photos and personal information that Harrison Industries had compiled about her and Thomas. They studied us like we were enemy combatants, learning everything about our finances, our relationships, our health problems, our daily routines. They used that information to design personalized destruction campaigns for each family they targeted. Senator Torres shook his head in disbelief. How many people were involved in this conspiracy? The FBI has arrested 127 individuals so far, including Harrison Industries executives, contracted specialists, and corrupt government officials. But Agent Reeves believes there are at least 50 more conspirators still at large, including the masterminds who financed the entire operation. Margaret's testimony continued for over 2 hours, detailing not just her own experience, but the stories of dozens of other victims she'd met during the investigation. There was Frank Miller, whose century-old family ranch in Colorado had been stolen through falsified environmental violations. There was Rosa Santos, whose New Mexico property had been contaminated with radioactive materials to force her evacuation. There was David Kim, whose Wyoming ranch had been destroyed by deliberately caused forest fires after he refused to sell. The pattern was always the same, Margaret explained. First, they would make generous offers to buy the property. When those offers were refused, they would begin harassment campaigns designed to make the landowners' lives unbearable. Stolen livestock, contaminated water, legal troubles, financial pressure, health problems. They had a playbook for breaking people down systematically. Senator Williams studied the detailed timeline that Agent Reeves had prepared. Mrs. Caldwell, what role did local law enforcement play in these schemes? Margaret's expression hardened. In many cases, Harrison Industries had corrupted entire county governments. Sheriff's departments that should have been investigating cattle theft were instead arresting the victims. District attorneys who should have been prosecuting corporate crimes were filing charges against innocent ranchers. County clerks were falsifying property records. The corruption went all the way to the top. This revelation had been among the most shocking discoveries of the FBI investigation. Harrison Industries hadn't just bribed individual officials. They had systematically infiltrated rural government structures, placing their own people in key positions or compromising existing officials through blackmail and financial incentives. We've learned that Harrison Industries maintained a network of over 200 corrupt officials across the western states. Margaret continued. Judges, prosecutors, sheriff's deputies, county assessors, environmental inspectors, even some federal employees. They turned the legal system into a weapon against the very people it's supposed to protect. Senator Torres leaned back in his chair, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy. Mrs. Caldwell, how did you find the strength to keep fighting when the entire system seemed to be working against you? Margaret smiled slightly, thinking of Thomas and the life they'd built together on their ranch. Senator, when you've spent 40 years building something with the person you love most in the world, you don't just give up when bullies try to take it away. Thomas always told me that the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. We're just temporary caretakers, responsible for protecting it for future generations. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I also had help from good people like Jake Morrison, who risked his own safety to expose the truth. And Agent Reeves, who treated rural victims with the same seriousness she would give to any other major crime. Not everyone in the system was corrupt. Senator Williams consulted her watch and realized the hearing had already run well over its scheduled time. But the testimony was too important to cut short. Mrs. Caldwell, what happened to the other victims of Harrison Industries? Have they been able to recover their losses? The federal government has established a victim compensation fund using Harrison Industries' seized assets. Margaret explained. Most families have gotten their property back, and everyone is receiving financial compensation for their losses. But you can't compensate people for the years of trauma, the health problems from poisoning, or the lives that were lost. Margaret's voice grew heavy with emotion as she continued. Bill Henderson will never see his ranch again. Thomas will never sit on our porch watching the sunset. Elena Rodriguez still has nightmares about her brakes failing on that mountain road. Some wounds don't heal just because the criminals get convicted. Agent Reeves, who was sitting in the gallery behind Margaret, felt a surge of admiration for the widow's grace under pressure. Over the months of investigation, she had watched Margaret transform from a grieving, isolated woman into a powerful advocate for rural justice. Her testimony was helping to build public support for the most comprehensive corporate crime legislation in decades. Senator Williams prepared to conclude the hearing. Mrs. Caldwell, do you have any final words for this committee and for the families across America who might be facing similar threats? Margaret stood up from the witness table and faced the cameras directly. I want every corporate executive watching this to understand something. Rural people aren't easy targets just because we live in small communities. We know our neighbors, we take care of each other, and we don't give up when people try to push us around." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "To the families who are dealing with suspicious legal troubles, mysterious health problems, or pressure to sell their land, document everything. Trust your instincts and don't fight alone. Contact the FBI. Call your congressional representatives. Reach out to other landowners in your area. The system works when good people demand justice." Margaret paused, thinking of all the victims who hadn't lived to see Harrison Industries brought to justice. And to Thomas Bill Henderson and all the others who didn't survive to see this day, your sacrifices weren't in vain. We're going to make sure this never happens to another family. As the hearing concluded, Margaret was surrounded by reporters, congressional staffers, and other victims who wanted to thank her for her courage in speaking out. But all she really wanted was to go home to Montana, to sit on her porch with a cup of coffee, and to watch her cattle grazing peacefully in the pastures that she and Thomas had protected together. The congressional hearing would lead to the passage of the Rural Property Protection Act, establishing federal oversight of large-scale land acquisitions and creating specialized FBI units to investigate corporate crimes against rural communities. Vincent Harding and 63 other Harrison Industries conspirators would receive lengthy federal prison sentences, with several facing life terms for murder and racketeering. But for Margaret, the real victory wasn't in Washington, D.C. It was back home in Cedar Valley, where the land endured, the truth had prevailed, and Thomas's memory lived on in every sunrise over the mountains he had loved. 2 years after her testimony before Congress, Margaret Caldwell found herself in an unexpected role, running the Margaret Caldwell Foundation for Rural Justice, a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting small landowners from corporate predation. The foundation operated from a converted barn on her ranch, staffed by former FBI agents, retired attorneys, and volunteers who had been inspired by her story. The foundation's phone rang constantly with calls from desperate families facing suspicious legal troubles, mysterious health problems, and pressure to sell their land. Margaret had become the unofficial guardian angel of rural America, the person people called when the system seemed stacked against them. On a crisp autumn morning, Margaret sat across from her latest case, Patricia Wong, a 52-year-old apple orchard owner from Oregon whose family had been farming the same land for 4 generations. Patricia's hands shook as she described a situation that sounded disturbingly familiar to Margaret. "It started 6 months ago with an offer to buy our orchard," Patricia explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "A company called Pacific Agricultural. Partners said they wanted to preserve family farms by buying them and leasing them back to the original owners. It sounded too good to be true, so my husband refused to meet with them." Margaret leaned forward, her instincts already alerting her to danger. "What happened after your husband refused?" "David got sick, really sick. Started with fatigue and memory problems, just like you described happening to your husband. Then, our apple trees began dying, 1 row at a time. The Agricultural Extension Office said it was a rare fungal infection, but it didn't respond to any treatment." Margaret exchanged glances with her foundation's lead investigator, former FBI agent Tommy Zhao, who was taking detailed notes. The pattern was unmistakably similar to Harrison Industries' methods, but the perpetrators had clearly learned from their predecessors' mistakes. "Patricia, have you noticed any unusual activity around your property? Strange vehicles, people you don't recognize, problems with your water or electrical systems?" Patricia nodded vigorously. "Our well water started tasting metallic 3 months ago. I had it tested privately, and the results showed elevated levels of copper and lead. But when the county health department tested it, they said everything was normal. They used different water samples than the ones I had collected." Agent Zhao looked up from his notes. Patricia, do you still have the private test results? Yes, and I've been collecting water samples weekly ever since, storing them in our freezer. I learned that trick from reading about Mrs. Caldwell's case. Online, Margaret felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. Patricia had been smart enough to document the evidence, but it meant another family was suffering the same systematic destruction that Harrison Industries had inflicted on rural communities across the West. Has Pacific Agricultural Partners made any additional contact since your husband got sick? Margaret asked. They sent a lawyer last week. Said they understood we were dealing with financial hardship due to David's medical bills and the crop failures. They offered to buy the orchard for twice what it's worth and pay all of David's medical expenses. They said it was a compassionate gesture to help a struggling farm family. Margaret's blood ran cold. The offer was almost identical to the strategies Harrison Industries had used to create problems, then present themselves as the solution. Patricia, under no circumstances should you sign anything or accept any money from these people. Agent Zhao, we need to contact Agent Reeves immediately. Within hours, Margaret's foundation had connected Patricia's case to similar incidents across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. Pacific Agricultural Partners was using refined versions of Harrison Industries' tactics, targeting family farms with valuable water rights or strategic development potential. But they had learned from Harrison Industries' mistakes, operating more carefully to avoid detection. Agent Diana Reeves, who had been promoted to head the FBI's new Rural Crimes Division following the Harrison Industries investigation, arrived in Oregon within 48 hours. She brought with her a team of specialists who had cut their teeth on the Harrison Industries case and were specifically trained to recognize corporate land fraud schemes. Margaret, we've been tracking suspicious activity in the Pacific Northwest for months, Agent Reeves explained as they toured Patricia's failing orchard. Pacific Agricultural Partners appears to be run by former Harrison Industries associates who escaped prosecution by being outside the country when we made our arrests. Margaret studied the dying apple trees, their leaves yellowed and curling despite the ideal growing conditions. How many families are they targeting? We've identified at least 30 properties across 3 states. The methods are more sophisticated. Then Harrison Industries used slower poisoning, more subtle record manipulation, better corruption of local officials. They learned from Vincent Harding's mistakes. Agent Reeves pulled out her tablet and showed Margaret a map dotted with red pins. Every red pin represents a family farm that's experienced suspicious problems in the past year. Crop failures, livestock deaths, water contamination, legal troubles, health crises, always followed by generous buyout offers from Pacific Agricultural Partners. Margaret felt the familiar rage building in her chest. They're doing it again. They're destroying families for profit, just like before. But this time, we're ready for them, Agent Reeves said grimly. The Rural Property Protection Act you helped pass gives us tools we didn't have during the Harrison Industries investigation. We can move faster, dig deeper, and coordinate with local law enforcement more effectively. The investigation that followed Patricia's report moved with lightning speed compared to the painstaking work that had exposed Harrison Industries. Agent Reeves' team had developed sophisticated techniques for detecting corporate land fraud, using everything from satellite imagery analysis to complex financial auditing to identify suspicious patterns. Within 2 weeks, they had documented evidence of Pacific Agricultural Partners' criminal activities across dozens of properties. The company had perfected a systematic approach to rural land acquisition that made Harrison Industries' methods look crude by comparison. They're using genetically modified agricultural pathogens to destroy specific crops, Dr. Jennifer Park, the FBI's agricultural crimes specialist, explained to Margaret and Patricia. The fungi and bacteria are designed to target particular varieties of plants while leaving others unaffected. It's agricultural warfare disguised as natural crop failure. Margaret stared at the laboratory reports documenting the artificial pathogens that had been introduced to Patricia's orchard. They're not just poisoning people anymore, they're poisoning the land itself. The scope of Pacific Agricultural Partners' operation was breathtaking in its ambition. They had recruited corrupt scientists to develop untraceable biological weapons against crops and livestock. They had infiltrated agricultural extension offices to provide false diagnoses of disease outbreaks. They had even corrupted soil and water testing laboratories to hide evidence of deliberate contamination. Margaret, they're not just after individual properties, Agent Reeves explained during a briefing at the Foundation headquarters. They're trying to destabilize entire agricultural regions to drive down land values and create opportunities for massive acquisitions. The plan was diabolically clever: create widespread agricultural failures that appeared to be natural disasters or disease outbreaks, then swoop in as benevolent investors offering to rescue struggling farm families. The acquired land would then be consolidated into massive industrial operations controlled by Pacific Agricultural Partners' shadow investors. Who's behind it? Margaret asked. Who has the resources to fund something this elaborate? Agent Reeves consulted her files. The money trail leads to a consortium of international investment firms specializing in agricultural commodities. They see American farmland as an undervalued asset class and are willing to use any means necessary to acquire control over food production. Margaret felt a chill as the implication sank in. This wasn't just about corporate greed, it was about foreign control of America's food supply, achieved through the systematic destruction of family farms that had fed the nation for generations. The Margaret Caldwell Foundation became the unofficial coordination center for the FBI's investigation, with Margaret herself serving as a liaison between federal agents and victimized farm families. Her experience with Harrison Industries had given her unique insights into corporate land fraud tactics, making her invaluable to the investigation. Patricia, I need you to understand something, Margaret told the Oregon orchard owner during one of their regular phone calls. This fight isn't just about saving your farm. It's about protecting the independence of American agriculture from foreign manipulation. Patricia's husband David had begun recovering as soon as they switched to bottled water and started following the Foundation's decontamination protocols. The apple trees were beyond saving, but Patricia had documented everything and was prepared to testify against Pacific Agricultural Partners when the case went to trial. Margaret, how do you keep fighting? Patricia asked. Doesn't it ever feel hopeless, knowing that as soon as you stop one criminal operation, another one starts up? Margaret considered the question as she looked out over her own ranch where her cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that Thomas had helped establish decades earlier. Patricia, evil people will always try to take what doesn't belong to them, but good people will always fight back. Every family we save, every criminal we expose, every corrupt official we remove from power, it all makes the next generation safer. Margaret's phone rang constantly with new cases: suspicious crop failures in Iowa, mysterious livestock deaths in Kansas, water contamination in Nebraska. Each case followed variations of the same pattern she'd first encountered with Harrison Industries, but the perpetrators were learning and adapting their methods. We're not just fighting individual companies anymore, Margaret explained to her foundation staff during their weekly meeting. We're fighting an entire industry that's built around the theft of rural property. It's like cutting off the head of a hydra to more grow back. Agent Zhao, who had become Margaret's most trusted investigator, nodded grimly. Margaret, I've been analyzing the patterns across all our cases. I think Pacific Agricultural Partners is just one arm of a much larger operation. There are probably dozens of similar companies operating across the country, all using slightly different methods, but working toward the same goal. Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. At 69, she should have been enjoying quiet retirement on her ranch, not fighting an endless war against corporate criminals. But Thomas's memory demanded justice, and the families calling for help deserved protection. "Then we'd better get to work," Margaret said simply. "Agent Reeves, what do we need to bring down the entire network?" The answer would require the largest coordinated investigation in FBI history, involving hundreds of agents across multiple states and federal agencies. But Margaret had learned something important during her battle with Harrison Industries. When good people stand together and refuse to give up, even the most powerful criminals can be defeated. The war for rural America was far from over, but Margaret Caldwell had no intention of surrendering the field to corporate predators who thought they could steal the land that generations of families had worked to build and protect. The break in the case came from an unexpected source: Dr. Alan Winters, the chief microbiologist at Pacific Agricultural Partners, who had designed many of the genetically modified pathogens being used to destroy family farms. His conscience had finally overcome his fear, and he contacted the Margaret Caldwell Foundation through an encrypted message sent to their secure website. Margaret met Dr. Winters at a truck stop outside Bozeman, Montana, far from any location where Pacific Agricultural Partners might have surveillance. The 45-year-old scientist looked haggard and sleep-deprived, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if expecting corporate assassins to appear at any moment. "Mrs. Caldwell, what I'm about to tell you could get me killed," Dr. Winters began, his hands trembling as he opened a laptop computer. "Pacific Agricultural Partners is just the tip of the iceberg. They're part of an international consortium called the Global Agricultural Consolidation Initiative, and they're planning the largest theft of American farmland in history." Margaret leaned closer, studying the complex organizational charts displayed on Winters' screen. The conspiracy was far more extensive than anything she had imagined, involving investment firms from 6 different countries and dozens of shell companies operating across the United States. "How did you get involved with these people?" Margaret asked. Dr. Winters closed his eyes, clearly struggling with guilt and shame. 5 years ago, I was a legitimate researcher working on disease-resistant crop varieties. Pacific Agricultural Partners recruited me with promises of unlimited research funding and the chance to solve world hunger through advanced biotechnology. I thought I was going to save the world. What changed your mind? I started seeing reports of mysterious crop failures in exactly the same geographic areas where I'd field-tested my pathogen research. When I asked my supervisors about it, they told me not to worry about applications outside my department. But I realized they were weaponizing my work to destroy the very farms I thought I was trying to help. Dr. Winters pulled up another file, this one containing detailed maps of the American Midwest overlaid with demographic data and property ownership information. "Mrs. Caldwell, they're not just targeting individual farms randomly. They've identified every family farm in America with valuable water rights, mineral deposits, or strategic development potential. This is a systematic conquest disguised as agricultural investment." Margaret studied the maps, recognizing patterns that reminded her of military invasion plans. Red zones indicated priority acquisition targets. Yellow zones showed secondary objectives, and green zones marked areas already under consortium control. "How many farms are we talking about?" Margaret asked quietly. "Over 15,000 properties across 38 states, representing approximately 40% of American agricultural production capacity. If they succeed, foreign investors will control nearly half of America's food supply within the next decade." The scope of the threat made Margaret feel physically sick. This wasn't just about corporate greed anymore. It was about national security, food sovereignty, and the survival of rural American communities that had existed for generations. Dr. Winters opened another file containing financial records and communication logs. "Mrs. Caldwell, I've documented everything. The biological weapons programs, The corruption networks, the assassination teams, the propaganda operations. I have enough evidence to destroy the entire conspiracy, but I can't survive long enough to testify unless the FBI provides witness protection. Margaret immediately called Agent Reeves, who arranged for Dr. Winters to be taken into federal custody within hours. The scientist's revelations triggered the largest agricultural crime investigation in FBI history, codenamed Operation Harvest Shield. Within days, federal agents were conducting simultaneous raids on Pacific Agricultural Partners facilities across the country, seizing biological samples, financial records, and communication equipment. The evidence they uncovered confirmed Dr. Winters' worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. "Margaret, this is bigger than anything we've ever encountered," Agent Reeves explained during an emergency briefing at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. The Global Agricultural Consolidation Initiative has been operating for over a decade, systematically infiltrating rural communities and government agencies across the entire country. Agent Reeves showed Margaret a presentation that had been seized from the consortium's headquarters in Switzerland. The document, titled American Agricultural Acquisition Strategy 2025 to 2035, outlined a 10-year plan to gain control of strategic farmland through a combination of economic manipulation, biological warfare, and political corruption. "They've been incredibly patient and methodical," Agent Reeves continued. Phase 1 involved identifying target properties and conducting detailed surveillance of farm families. Phase 2 focused on infiltrating local government agencies and agricultural institutions. Phase 3, which they're implementing now, involves systematic destruction of family farms, followed by acquisition offers. Margaret reviewed the presentation materials, feeling a growing sense of horror as the conspiracy's true scope became clear. "Agent Reeves, how many government officials are compromised?" "We've identified over 400 individuals in positions of authority who have been receiving payments from consortium shell companies, county commissioners, agricultural inspectors, water authority officials, even some federal employees. The corruption reaches all the way to Washington." The investigation revealed that the Global Agricultural Consolidation Initiative had spent over $200 million corrupting American officials over the past decade. They had effectively purchased entire county governments in strategic rural areas, ensuring that their criminal activities would face no local opposition. "But Margaret, there's something even more disturbing," Agent Reeves said, her expression growing grave. "We've uncovered evidence that the Fundu Consortium has been manipulating commodity markets to artificially depress the value of American farmland. They've been shorting agricultural futures while simultaneously destroying crops, profiting both from the market manipulation and the forced property sales." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the complexity and audacity of the conspiracy. These weren't just criminals. They were economic terrorists using sophisticated financial instruments to destabilize American agriculture for profit. The Margaret Caldwell Foundation's phone system crashed under the volume of calls from farm families who had seen news reports about Operation Harvest Shield and realized they might be victims of the consortium's activities. Margaret worked 18-hour days coordinating with FBI field offices, providing guidance to terrified families, and helping investigators understand the patterns of rural victimization. "Mrs. Caldwell, I don't know what to do," sobbed Carol Freeman, a dairy farmer from Wisconsin whose herd had been dying mysteriously for months. "The veterinarians can't figure out what's killing my cows. The bank is threatening foreclosure, and some company keeps calling with offers to buy my farm." Margaret had heard variations of Carol's story dozens of times over the past week. "Carol, listen to me carefully. Do not sign anything. Do not accept any money. And do not trust any official who tells you there's nothing suspicious about your situation. I'm sending Agent Martinez to your farm today, and she's going to help you document everything." The consortium's response to Operation Harvest Shield was swift and vicious. Corporate lawyers flooded federal courts with motions to suppress evidence, claiming that the FBI raids violated international business law. Lobbyists swarmed Capitol Hill, arguing that the investigation threatened legitimate agricultural investment and could damage America's relationship with allied nations. More disturbing were the direct threats against Margaret and her foundation. Staff, someone broke into her ranch house, leaving behind a cryptic message. Some battles are too big for widows. Her phone lines were hacked, her computer systems attacked, and unmarked vehicles began conducting surveillance of her property. Margaret, "We're moving you to a secure location," Agent Reeves announced after the third break-in attempt. "The consortium has a track record of eliminating witnesses, and you've become too valuable to their prosecution to remain unprotected." Margaret refused to abandon her ranch or her foundation work. "Agent Reeves, I didn't back down when Harrison Industries tried to intimidate me, and I'm not backing down now. If they want to threaten me, they'd better be prepared for a fight." Instead, Margaret agreed to accept round-the-clock federal protection while continuing her work from the foundation's reinforced headquarters. The converted barn on her ranch became a fortress, surrounded by FBI agents and equipped with military-grade security systems. The consortium's media campaign against the investigation was sophisticated and relentless. They funded think tanks and academic institutions to publish studies questioning the federal government's authority to regulate international agricultural investment. They hired public relations firms to portray Margaret as an unstable widow whose grief had led her to see conspiracies where none existed. They're using the same playbook that tobacco companies used to fight cancer research, Agent Zhao observed as he monitored the consortium's propaganda efforts. Create doubt about the evidence, attack the credibility of witnesses, and claim that government regulation will destroy the economy. But the consortium had underestimated the power of Margaret's story and the determination of rural Americans who had been victimized by corporate land fraud. Farm families across the country began organizing resistance networks, sharing information about suspicious activities and coordinating with FBI investigators. "Margaret, you've started something that the consortium can't stop," Agent Reeves told her during one of their regular briefings. "Rural communities that have been isolated and vulnerable for decades are now connected and fighting back." The consortium's business model depends on picking off individual families one at a time, but they can't handle organized resistance. The first major victory came when federal prosecutors secured guilty pleas from 12 Pacific Agricultural Partners executives, including CEO Richard Hoffman, who agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for reduced sentences. Hoffman's testimony revealed the consortium's operational structure and identified key figures who had previously been hidden behind layers of shell companies. "Mrs. Caldwell, I want to apologize personally for what my company did to you and to Caldwell. I want to apologize personally for what my company did to you and to hundreds of other families," Hoffman said during his deposition, which Margaret attended via video link. "I convinced myself that we were improving agricultural efficiency, but I knew we were destroying innocent people's lives." Margaret looked at the broken man on her screen, a Harvard MBA, who had orchestrated the systematic destruction of family farms and was now facing 20 years in federal prison. "Mr. Hoffman, your apology doesn't bring back my husband or restore the farms you destroyed. But if you're truly sorry, you'll help us stop the people who are still carrying out these crimes." Hoffman's cooperation led to the arrests of 53 additional consortium members, including the shadowy financiers who had funded the agricultural warfare campaign. Bank accounts containing over $800 million in stolen assets were frozen, pending restitution to victimized families. But Margaret knew the fight was far from over. Dr. Winters had warned her that the Global Agricultural Consolidation Initiative had backup plans and contingency operations that could continue even if Pacific Agricultural Partners was completely dismantled. Agent Reeves, what happens when the next company starts using the same tactics? Margaret asked as they reviewed the latest intelligence reports. How do we stop this from happening again? Agent Reeves smiled grimly. Margaret, that's exactly what we're going to find out. Because I guarantee you, someone else is already planning the next phase of this war against rural America. Agent Reeves was right. Within 6 months of Pacific Agricultural Partners' collapse, a new threat emerged that would test every lesson Margaret had learned about corporate warfare against rural America. This time, the enemy was even more dangerous because it appeared to be completely legitimate. The company called itself American Heritage Farms, and their marketing materials painted them as the saviors of family agriculture. They promised to preserve traditional farming methods while providing financial security to struggling rural families through innovative leaseback agreements. Their spokesperson was Jennifer Walsh, the same Jennifer Walsh who had been married to the corrupt District Attorney Sarah Walsh. During the Harrison Industries scandal, Margaret discovered the connection while reviewing applications for assistance submitted to her foundation. 3 families in different states had contacted the foundation about problems with American Heritage Farms, and when Agent Zhao began investigating, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. Margaret, Jennifer Walsh isn't just working for American Heritage Farms, Agent Zhao reported during their morning briefing. She's the primary architect of their acquisition strategy, and she's using everything she learned from the Harrison Industries prosecution to make their operation bulletproof. Margaret felt a chill as she reviewed Walsh's background file. After her husband's corruption conviction, Jennifer Walsh had seemingly disappeared from Montana. But she had actually been recruited by the Global Agricultural Consolidation Initiative's remaining leadership to design a new approach to rural property theft, one that would appear completely legal and ethical. What makes American Heritage Farms different from the previous criminal operations? Margaret asked. Agent Zhao pulled up a complex legal document on his tablet. They're using legitimate contracts and authentic legal processes, but the agreements are designed to systematically transfer ownership from farm families to the consortium over time. It's theft disguised as business, and victims don't realize what's happening until it's too late. The scheme was diabolically clever. American Heritage Farms would approach struggling family farms with offers to purchase the property and immediately lease it back to the original owners. The farmers would receive an upfront payment and continue operating their land. But the lease agreements contained provisions that gradually transferred more control to American Heritage Farms. Margaret, look at this lease contract, Agent Zhao said, highlighting key passages. The farmer agrees to follow all of American Heritage Farms' agricultural best practices, which gives the company authority to dictate everything from crop selection to livestock management. If the farmer violates any of these requirements, American Heritage Farms can terminate the lease and evict them from their own land. Margaret studied the document, recognizing the sophisticated legal trap that Jennifer Walsh had designed. The requirements are impossible to meet, aren't they? Exactly. American Heritage Farms deliberately set standards that no real farmer could follow, then uses the inevitable violations to justify lease terminations. The families lose their land, their homes, and their livelihoods, but American Heritage Farms keeps the money they paid up front. The first victim Margaret met was Robert Chen, not the lawyer who had helped her fight Harrison Industries, but a corn farmer from Illinois who shared the same name. Robert had signed with American Heritage Farms 6 months earlier, desperate to avoid foreclosure on his 300-acre farm that had been in his family for 4 generations. Mrs. Caldwell, I thought I was saving my farm, Robert explained during a video call with Margaret and Agent Zhao. American Heritage Farms paid off my debts and promised I could keep farming my land for as long as I wanted. But now they're claiming I violated my contract because my corn yield was 2% lower than their minimum requirement. Margaret reviewed Robert's lease agreement, noting the microscopic font size and deliberately confusing legal language. "Robert, did you have a lawyer review this contract before you signed it?" "I couldn't afford one." American Heritage Farms said their contracts were standard industry agreements and that I shouldn't waste money on legal fees. They even provided their own notary to witness the signing. This was another innovation Jennifer Walsh had developed. American Heritage Farms would target farmers who were already in financial distress and couldn't afford proper legal representation. The company's representatives would create artificial time pressure, claiming that the offers were only valid for limited periods, forcing desperate families to make hasty decisions without adequate counsel. "Margaret, we've identified 47 families across 12 states who have signed similar agreements," Agent Joe reported. American Heritage Farms is systematically targeting the most vulnerable farmers in America, people who are already facing foreclosure or bankruptcy and have no other options. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the legal trickery. American Heritage Farms sales representatives were trained to present themselves as fellow farmers who understood rural values and traditions. They would spend hours with potential clients, sharing meals and building personal relationships before introducing the business proposition. "They made me feel like they were family friends trying to help us through a difficult time," explained Maria Santos, a New Mexico rancher, whose family had fallen behind on property taxes after her husband's medical bills depleted their savings. The sales rep, Danny Morrison, said his own grandfather had lost the family farm during the Great Depression, and he didn't want to see the same thing happen to us. Margaret's blood ran cold when she heard the name. "Agent Zhao, did she say Danny Morrison?" "Yes." "Margaret, what's wrong?" Margaret felt sick as the implications sank in. "Danny Morrison was the teenage boy who helped me take care of my cattle. He knew about our financial situation, our property boundaries, our daily routines. If American Heritage Farms recruited him, they have inside information about every family in Cedar Valley." The investigation that followed revealed that American Heritage Farms had been systematically recruiting young people from rural communities, training them to identify vulnerable families and exploit personal relationships for corporate gain. Danny Morrison wasn't the only local person who had been corrupted. The company had agents embedded in rural communities across America. "Margaret, they've created a network of rural informants who report on their neighbors' financial problems, family disputes, health crises, and other vulnerabilities," Agent Reeves explained during an emergency conference call. American Heritage Farms receives detailed intelligence about potential targets long before their sales representatives make contact. The betrayal hit Margaret harder than any of the previous corporate attacks. Harrison Industries had been outsiders, trying to steal her land, but American Heritage Farms had corrupted people from her own community, people she had trusted and helped. "How do we fight an enemy that recruits our own neighbors against us?" Margaret asked Agent Reeves. "The same way we've always fought them, by exposing the truth and building stronger communities." Margaret, rural America's greatest strength has always been neighbors helping neighbors. "We need to remind people that corporations can never replace genuine community bonds." Margaret's foundation launched an unprecedented education campaign, warning rural communities about American Heritage Farms tactics and training local leaders to recognize sophisticated manipulation techniques. They created simple legal guides explaining the warning signs of predatory contracts and established a network of volunteer attorneys willing to provide free consultations to threatened farmers. The breakthrough came when Margaret received a call from an unexpected source, Dr. Jennifer Walsh herself, the architect of American Heritage Farms' legal strategy. Walsh contacted the foundation through an encrypted channel, claiming she wanted to provide information about her employer's operations. "Mrs. Caldwell, I know you have no reason to trust me," Walsh said during their first conversation. "My husband's corruption helped Harrison Industries victimize your family and many others. But I've seen what American Heritage Farms is planning next, and it's going to destroy rural America permanently. Margaret was deeply suspicious of Walsh's motives. But Agent Reeves convinced her that the intelligence could be valuable, even if Walsh wasn't genuinely repentant. "Jennifer, why are you contacting us now?" Margaret asked during their second conversation. "Because American Heritage Farms isn't planning to stop with individual farm acquisitions. They're preparing something called Operation Rural Reset, a coordinated campaign to acquire entire rural counties and convert them into corporate-controlled agricultural zones." Walsh explained that American Heritage Farms had been quietly buying up not just individual farms, but also rural businesses, schools, medical facilities, and government buildings. Their goal was to achieve total economic control over targeted rural areas, essentially transforming traditional communities into corporate company towns. "Mrs. Caldwell, they're planning to eliminate family farming entirely," Walsh continued. "Every farm, every ranch, every rural business will be owned and controlled by the consortium. The people who live there will become employees rather than independent landowners." The scope of Operation Rural Reset was breathtaking in its ambition. American Heritage Farms had identified 50 rural counties across America where they could achieve majority land ownership within 5 years. Once they controlled the economic base of these communities, they would have effective political control as well. "Jennifer, how do we stop them?" Margaret asked. "You need to expose their financial structure before they complete the current acquisition phase. American Heritage Farms is leveraging their existing properties to secure loans for additional purchases. If you can prove that their leaseback agreements are fraudulent, their entire financing scheme will collapse." Walsh provided Margaret with internal American Heritage Farms documents showing that the company had been systematically lying to banks about the terms and enforceability of their lease agreements. They had been counting fraudulent leases as valuable assets to secure loans worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Agent Reeves, this is securities fraud on a massive scale," Margaret realized as she reviewed Walsh's evidence. "They're not just stealing individual farms, they're defrauding the entire banking system." The FBI's investigation into American Heritage Farms' financial practices revealed a criminal conspiracy that dwarfed even the Harrison Industries and Pacific Agricultural Partners cases. The company had been creating fake lease agreements, inflating property values, and manipulating financial records to deceive lenders, investors, and government regulators. Margaret, Jennifer Walsh has provided us with enough evidence to shut down American Heritage Farms permanently, Agent Reeves announced after weeks of investigation. But more importantly, she's given us the information we need to trace the money back to the Global Agricultural Consolidation Initiative's ultimate financial backers. The paper trail led to a consortium of international investment firms that had been funding rural property theft operations for over 2 decades. The same financial entities that had backed Harrison Industries and Pacific Agricultural Partners were also behind American Heritage Farms and at least 12 other similar companies operating across America. "Agent Reeves, how many rural families have been victimized by this conspiracy?" Margaret asked as they reviewed the scope of the investigation. "Based on the evidence we've collected, over 8,000 families have lost their property to various consortium operations over the past 15 years. The total value of stolen land and assets exceeds $12 billion. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the conspiracy and the number of families who had suffered the same injustices she had experienced. But she also felt a surge of determination. Every family they saved from American Heritage Farms represented a victory over the forces that had murdered her husband and tried to destroy her life. "Agent Reeves, what do we need to do to bring down the entire network?" "Margaret, we need you to do something that might be the most dangerous thing you've ever done. We need you to go undercover and attend American Heritage Farms National Conference. where the consortium leadership will be meeting to plan the next phase of Operation Rural Reset. Margaret didn't hesitate. When do we start? The American Heritage Farms National Conference was being held at an exclusive resort in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where the company's top executives, international investors, and key operatives would gather to plan what they called the final phase of rural transformation. Margaret would attend undercover as Catherine Miller, a wealthy widow from Texas who was interested in investing in agricultural real estate. Agent Reeves spent 3 weeks preparing Margaret for the most dangerous undercover operation of her life. The FBI created a complete false identity, including financial records, property ownership documents, and a carefully constructed personal history that would withstand scrutiny from sophisticated corporate investigators. Margaret, you need to understand that everyone at this conference will be a trained manipulator, Agent Reeves warned during one of their preparation sessions. They'll be studying your every word and gesture, looking for any sign that you're not who you claim to be. One mistake could expose the entire investigation. Margaret had never been an actress, but she had spent years dealing with corporate predators who had tried to deceive and manipulate her. She understood their psychology and their tactics better than most FBI agents. Agent Reeves, these people destroyed my husband and tried to destroy me. I've been studying their methods for years. I know how they think and how they operate. The resort in Jackson Hole was everything Margaret had expected, an isolated luxury compound where wealthy criminals could plan their crimes without fear of observation by honest people. Margaret arrived driving a rented Mercedes and wearing expensive clothes that the FBI had purchased to support her cover identity. The conference registration process was more thorough than Margaret had anticipated. American Heritage Farms had hired a private security company to conduct background checks on all attendees, and Margaret's fake identity was subjected to detailed scrutiny before she was allowed to enter the main conference area. Ms. Miller, welcome to Jackson Hole, said Rebecca Torres, American Heritage Farms Director of Investor Relations. We're always excited to meet successful individuals who share our vision for modernizing American agriculture. Margaret smiled and shook Torres' hand, reminding herself to maintain the persona of a wealthy widow looking for profitable investments, rather than the grieving rancher seeking justice that she really was. The conference's opening session was a masterclass in corporate propaganda. American Heritage Farm CEO Michael Stevens delivered a presentation titled Saving Rural America Through Strategic Modernization, which portrayed their criminal conspiracy as a humanitarian mission to rescue struggling farm families. Ladies and gentlemen, Stevens announced to the audience of investors and operatives, traditional family farming is dying because it cannot compete in the modern global economy. American Heritage Farms offers these families dignity and security while transitioning America's agricultural resources to more efficient management. Margaret listened to Stevens' speech with growing revulsion, recognizing the same sanitized language that Harrison Industries had used to justify their crimes. The man was describing the systematic theft of family farms as if it were a charitable endeavor. During the first day's break, Margaret mingled with other conference attendees, gathering intelligence about the scope of American Heritage Farms operations. She learned that the company had active operations in 38 states and was planning to expand internationally within 2 years. Catherine, what brings you to agricultural investment? Asked Jonathan Walsh, one of American Heritage Farms regional directors and Jennifer Walsh's brother-in-law. Margaret felt a surge of recognition but forced herself to maintain her cover. My late husband left me with considerable assets, and I'm looking for investments that provide both financial returns and social benefits, Margaret replied, drawing on the backstory that Agent Reeves had helped her develop. Agricultural modernization seems to offer both. Walsh nodded approvingly. You'll find that American Heritage Farms provides opportunities that traditional agricultural investments simply cannot match. We're not just buying farmland, were transforming entire rural communities. That evening, Margaret attended a private dinner for major investors, where American Heritage Farms leadership presented their confidential plans for Operation Rural Reset. The presentation was chilling in its scope and ambition. By 2030, American Heritage Farms will control agricultural production in 50 rural counties, announced Dr. Patricia Kim, the company's strategic planning director. We will have achieved what no corporation in American history has accomplished: complete vertical integration of rural life, from food production to local government. Dr. Kim's presentation included detailed maps showing the targeted counties, demographic analyses of the populations that would be displaced, and financial projections for the profits that would be generated from total corporate control of rural areas. Our research indicates that rural Americans are particularly susceptible to certain psychological triggers, Dr. Kim continued, displaying slides that reminded Margaret of military intelligence briefings. Appeals to tradition, family values, and economic security are most effective in gaining initial compliance with our acquisition offers. Margaret struggled to maintain her composure as she listened to these corporate executives discussing rural Americans like they were livestock, to be managed and exploited. The casual cruelty of their planning was almost unbearable. "Dr. Kim, what resistance should we expect from local communities?" asked one of the international investors, a man with a thick European accent whose name tag identified him as Klaus Weber from Swiss Agricultural Holdings. "Minimal, if we execute the plan correctly," Dr. Kim replied confidently. "Rural communities that lose their economic independence quickly lose their political independence as well. Once we control employment, housing, and local businesses, resistance becomes economically impossible." During a coffee break, Margaret approached Jennifer Walsh, who was attending the conference as American Heritage Farms legal consultant, despite having provided information to the FBI just weeks earlier. "Jennifer, I'm Catherine Miller," Margaret said, extending her hand. "I understand you've developed some innovative legal strategies for rural property acquisition." Walsh studied Margaret's face carefully, and for a moment Margaret worried that her cover had been blown. But Walsh simply smiled and shook her hand. "Ms. Miller, our legal frameworks are designed to provide maximum protection for both our investors and the rural families we're helping to transition out of traditional farming. We've learned from the mistakes made by earlier companies in this sector." Margaret realized that Walsh was referring to Harrison Industries and Pacific Agricultural Partners without naming them directly. The woman was essentially bragging about having perfected the art of legal theft. "What kind of mistakes?" Margaret asked innocently. "Earlier operations were too aggressive and too obvious," Walsh explained. "They used crude tactics like livestock theft and property record falsification that created unnecessary legal exposure. Our approach is more subtle and ultimately more effective." That night, Margaret lay awake in her luxury hotel suite, recording detailed notes about everything she had observed and overheard. The miniature recording devices that the FBI had concealed in her clothing and jewelry had captured hours of incriminating conversations, but Margaret wanted to ensure that no crucial details were lost. The second day of the conference focused on operational details and expansion plans. American Heritage Farms regional directors presented reports on their territories, describing their successes in acquiring properties and eliminating resistance from local communities. "The Montana operation has been particularly successful," announced Danny Morrison, the young man who had once helped Margaret care for her cattle and was now one of American Heritage Farms' top acquisition specialists. "We've identified 17 vulnerable properties in the Cedar Valley region, including some targets with significant water rights." Margaret felt sick as she realized that Danny was describing plans to steal her neighbors' farms using the same tactics that Harrison Industries had used against her. The boy she had trusted and helped was now working to destroy other families in her community. "Danny, what makes the Cedar Valley region particularly attractive?" asked another attendee. "The area has an aging population of landowners who are financially vulnerable and socially isolated," Danny replied with the clinical detachment of a corporate predator. "Many of the properties have been in the same families for generations, which creates emotional leverage we can exploit during negotiations." Margaret wanted to stand up and confront Danny directly, but she forced herself to maintain her cover. The intelligence she was gathering could prevent dozens of families from being victimized, but only if she could complete the mission without being discovered. The conference's final session featured a presentation by Klaus Weber, who revealed that the Global Agricultural Consolidation Initiative was planning similar operations in Canada, Australia, and Argentina. The American project was just the beginning of a worldwide campaign to transfer rural property from traditional farming families to international corporate investors. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not just transforming American agriculture," Weber announced. "We are pioneering a new model of rural development that will be implemented across the globe. The profits generated from the American operations will fund expansion into other countries where traditional landowners represent inefficient use of agricultural resources." Margaret realized that she was witnessing the planning stages of an international crime spree that would dwarf anything the consortium had previously attempted. They weren't just stealing American farmland. They were developing a systematic approach to rural conquest that could be exported worldwide. As the conference concluded, Margaret made her final rounds of intelligence gathering, collecting business cards, memorizing faces, and recording conversations that would provide the FBI with detailed information about the conspiracy's leadership structure. "Ms. Miller, I hope we'll see you at our next investor meeting," said Michael Stevens as Margaret prepared to leave the resort. "American Heritage Farms always welcomes partners who understand our vision for rural transformation." "I'm definitely interested in learning more," Margaret replied, maintaining her cover even as she prepared to provide the FBI with evidence that would destroy Stevens and everyone else in the room. As Margaret drove away from Jackson Hole, she felt a mixture of triumph and revulsion. She had successfully infiltrated the heart of the conspiracy that had murdered her husband and terrorized rural communities across America. The evidence she had gathered would bring down American Heritage Farms and expose the Global Agricultural Consolidation Initiative's international operations. But she had also witnessed the planning of crimes that would victimize thousands of additional families if the FBI couldn't act quickly enough to prevent them. The final battle for rural America was about to begin, and Margaret Caldwell intended to make sure that justice prevailed over corporate greed. The war that had started with her husband's murder and her own arrest was finally approaching its climax, and Margaret was ready to finish what Thomas would have wanted her to complete. The evidence Margaret gathered at Jackson Hole triggered the largest coordinated law enforcement operation in rural American history. At exactly 6 a.m. on a cold November morning, FBI agents simultaneously raided 127 locations across 38 states, arresting American Heritage Farms executives, seizing financial records, and freezing assets worth over $3 billion. Margaret watched the raids unfold from the FBI's command center in Denver, where Agent Reeves had invited her to witness the culmination of their years-long investigation. Television screens displayed live footage of federal agents leading handcuffed executives from luxury offices, while radio communications provided real-time updates from field teams across the country. "Margaret, every arrest we're making today represents families who will keep their farms because of your courage," Agent Reeves said as they watched Michael Stevens being taken into custody outside American Heritage Farms headquarters in Chicago. But the most satisfying arrest for Margaret was Danny Morrison, who was captured at his apartment in Billings while preparing to flee the country. The young man who had betrayed her trust and planned to destroy her neighbors was now facing federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The international scope of the operation was unprecedented. Swiss authorities arrested Klaus Weber and 6 other global agricultural consolidation initiative leaders, while law enforcement agencies in Canada, Australia, and Argentina moved to shut down affiliated operations before they could expand beyond the planning stages. Mrs. Caldwell, said FBI Director Rebecca Chen during a video conference call with Margaret and Agent Reeves, "Your undercover work in Jackson Hole provided us with evidence of crimes we didn't even know were being planned. You've prevented what could have been the largest theft of rural property in world history." Within weeks, the seized evidence revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Over 12,000 families had been victimized by various consortium operations, with total damages exceeding $15 billion. The criminal network had involved over 800 individuals, including corporate executives, corrupt officials, and local operatives like Danny Morrison. Margaret's foundation was overwhelmed with applications for assistance as news of the arrest spread through rural communities. Families who had lost their farms to fraudulent schemes years earlier were finally learning the truth about what had happened to them. "Mrs. Caldwell, I thought I was just a failure as a farmer," said Robert Patterson, whose family ranch in Colorado had been stolen through a Harrison Industries operation 3 years earlier. "I never imagined that we were victims of an international criminal conspiracy." Can we get our land back? The answer in most cases was yes. Federal courts ordered the restoration of illegally acquired properties to their original owners, while a victim compensation fund provided financial assistance to families who had suffered losses. Margaret worked tirelessly with FBI agents and federal prosecutors to ensure that every victimized family received justice. The trials that followed were media spectacles that captivated the nation. Vincent Harding, the architect of Margaret's original persecution, received a life sentence for multiple murders, including Thomas Caldwell's poisoning death. Michael Stevens was sentenced to 60 years for conspiracy and fraud. Even Jennifer Walsh, despite her cooperation with the FBI, received 10 years for her role in designing the legal frameworks that had enabled the thefts. "Your Honor," Margaret said during her victim impact statement at Stevens' sentencing hearing, "these criminals didn't just steal property, they murdered my husband, destroyed rural communities, and tried to eliminate family farming from America. Their sentences need to reflect the magnitude of their crimes." Judge Patricia Williams, who had presided over Margaret's original hearing years earlier, nodded as she delivered Stevens' sentence. "Mr. Stevens, you and your associates waged war against rural America and the values that built this nation. This court intends to ensure that you never again have the opportunity to harm innocent families." The congressional hearings that followed led to comprehensive reforms in agricultural regulation, rural law enforcement, and corporate oversight. The Rural Protection Act was expanded to include international monitoring provisions, while new federal agencies were created specifically to investigate crimes against agricultural communities. Margaret testified before Congress again, this time as a recognized expert on corporate rural crime rather than a victimized widow seeking justice. Her recommendations shaped federal policy and helped establish permanent protections for family farms across America. Congress has the opportunity to ensure that no other family suffers what Thomas and I endured, Margaret told the packed hearing room. But protecting rural America requires constant vigilance against those who see our land and our communities as nothing more than profit opportunities. 5 years after that first day when she was handcuffed in Judge Reynolds' courtroom, Margaret stood on her ranch watching her cattle graze in pastures that were finally permanently safe from corporate predators. The Margaret Caldwell Foundation had helped over 3,000 families recover their stolen properties, while preventing countless additional thefts through education and early intervention. Jake Morrison, now in his 70s but still Margaret's closest friend and advisor, joined her on the porch where she and Thomas used to watch sunsets together. "Thomas would be proud of what you've accomplished," Jake said quietly. You turned your grief into a force that protected thousands of families. Margaret smiled, feeling her husband's presence in the familiar Montana landscape that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. Thomas always said that the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. I think I finally understand what he meant. The foundation continued its work, but Margaret had trained a new generation of rural advocates who could carry on the mission of protecting family farms from corporate predation. At 73, she was finally ready to enjoy the peaceful retirement that Thomas had envisioned for them. But peace didn't mean inactivity. Margaret wrote a book about her experiences, established a scholarship fund for rural students studying law and agriculture, and continued to mentor families facing suspicious pressure to sell their properties. Mrs. Caldwell, said Elena Rodriguez during a foundation reunion, you saved my life when my brakes were sabotaged, but more importantly, you showed me that ordinary people can defeat powerful criminals if they refuse to give up. Margaret looked around the room at the dozens of families who had survived corporate attacks because they had stood together and fought back. Rural Americans had learned that their greatest strength wasn't in isolation, but in community neighbors helping neighbors, sharing information, and refusing to let criminals pick them off one by one. Thomas used to say that evil only wins when good people do nothing, Margaret reflected. I spent years thinking I was just one widow fighting an impossible battle. But I learned that when you stand up for what's right, you're never really alone. As the sun set over Cedar Valley, Margaret sat in Thomas's old chair on their porch, holding the coffee mug he had used every morning for 40 years. The cattle were safely in the pastures, the water was clean, the land was secure. The corporate predators who had terrorized rural America were behind bars, and the laws had been changed to protect future generations of farm families. Margaret Caldwell had kept her promise to Thomas. She had held onto their ranch, exposed his killers, and built a legacy that would protect rural America long after she was gone. The widow who had been handcuffed and humiliated in a small town courthouse had become the most feared enemy of corporate criminals across the globe. I kept our promise, Thomas, she whispered to the Montana sky. The land endures, the truth endures, justice endures. And in the distance, the cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that would remain forever free. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.